Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today for the Frontier Tech webinar. We'll be starting very shortly. I'm just waiting for a few more attendees, but stay tuned, we'll be ready in a few minutes. Okay, everyone, thanks for joining us for the Future of Frontier Tech webinar. We'll be discussing trends in drone, space, and AR, VR technology. Just a few notes before we get started. If you guys have questions during the webinar, just feel free to ask them anytime at the questions tab, which you'll see on the side. And also, we'll be at hashtag CBI Frontier Tech, tweeting about the webinar and findings during the presentation. So feel free to tweet us at CB Insights as well. So just another note before we get started, the webinar will be recorded and will be distributed right after the presentation. So you'll be able to have that with you guys in your email after the webinar is completed. And again, we're at CB Insights on Twitter, hashtag CBI Frontier Tech. Feel free to join the conversation. Just a quick bit about our presenter today. It's Mike Dempsey from the research team. He's been quoted and his analysis has been widely distributed in media outlets like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Bloomberg, among others. He graduated from NYU and spearheaded a lot of our efforts here around the frontier tech space and what's going on in startup as well as what bigger players are doing in the space. So with that, we're going to get started. I'm going to hand it over to Mike, and he's going to walk you guys through what's going on the latest in frontier tech. So turning over to Mike.
Thanks, Matt. So first, just talk a little bit about CB Insights. What we do is we're a unique combination of data science and machine learning to help you see what's next. So whether that's your next client, your next customer, your next investment, your next acquisition, that's what we do. We're backed by the National Science Foundation, and we use machine learning to do all of that. And some of our clients include people like Cisco, Salesforce, Castrol, and Gartner, as well as top-tier venture capitalists like NEA, Upfront Ventures, RRE, and First Merc Capital. And here are a few of the happy customers we have. We feel like we have the most publicly referenceable customers of anyone in the industry, and you can go to cbinsights.com/customerlove to read about those. This is a little bit about our mantra. It's called "In God We Trust, all others must bring data." So I guess it's the thought process of probability trumps punditry. And so with that, we're going to get started. In the next 30 to 45 minutes, we're going to cover a lot of broad trends around frontier tech. How's it changing? A few notable exits in the space, who the most active VCs are across each of the industries that we're looking at, where corporates are investing, and then even a little bit around the use cases that are emerging in space, drones, and AR, VR, and then what areas are overfunded and underfunded as well. So first, the definition of frontier tech, how we define it, is just basically technology related to drones, space, augmented reality, and virtual reality. So space companies include those that are working on a variety of problems, including space travel, rocket propulsion, and then also some more contemporary technologies like satellite imagery, even asteroid mining, space debris cleanup, and much more. On the drone side, that includes all types of unmanned aerial vehicles and then also underwater drones. And so these are companies that are either manufacturing the drones themselves, utilizing drone technology and to provide a service, as well as supporting some of the infrastructure around it. Augmented reality and virtual reality includes all the companies related to the usage or support of these platforms. So augmented reality is essentially augmenting your real world with digital digital views and digital images, and virtual reality is putting all those digital images inside a virtual environment. So looking at companies that build the hardware, the software, different platforms, and other types of companies that utilize AR, VR technology for commercial purposes. So just a brief overview of funding there that we're going to skip through. Since 2014, nearly $3.5 billion has been raised in equity financing to frontier tech companies. And a lot of these high-level trends on overall frontier tech we're going to just briefly go over because we're going to dig into each sector more in depth. So here you can see, frontier tech activity has drastically picked up in the past 5 or 6 months as it kind of, or 5 or 6 quarters as it should, being an emerging space. Q1 15 has been by far the biggest, mostly due to SPACEX's $1 billion financing at the time. And as the industry has really developed, there have been 11 $50 million plus equity financings to these frontier tech companies since 2014. So if we're looking at some of the most active VCs in the space, overall, it's Rothenberg Ventures, Google Ventures, and Intel Capital, with Lux Capital and Qualcomm Ventures really rounding out that top 5. And Rothenberg Ventures you're going to hear a lot about because of a lot of their VR investments. Google Ventures is invested across the spectrum as well, and Intel Capital similarly. When we're looking at exits, probably the 2 most notable exits in the space have been Oculus, which was acquired by Facebook for $2 billion in March of 2014. And Oculus makes the Oculus Rift, which is a virtual reality headset. And they've really been kind of at the forefront of this new wave of VR. So their use cases range from gaming to media and more. We're going to dig into that a little bit. On the flip side, we have Skybox Imaging, which was acquired by Google in June of 2014 for $500 million. And Skybox Imaging is a commercial remote sensing technology company that they use satellites to basically provide insight into daily activity on Earth. And so some of their use cases have been improving Google Maps, and then all the way over, we would imagine, to more experimental use cases like Google's project for understanding optimal solar panel placement and things like that. 2 of the other main ones, I guess, since 2012 is Blackbridge, which was acquired by Planet Labs, and YurTheCast, which is actually an interesting company. They went public via reverse merger, and YurTheCast essentially, what we're going to talk about a lot is nanosatellites and imaging of the Earth, at least on the space side of things. And YurTheCast took a different approach and provides a near-live HD video feed of Earth with multiple cameras attached to the space station. So it's almost a little different model, but it was a pretty interesting IPO at the time. Corporates have been fairly active in the space overall. You see names like Google Ventures and Qualcomm and Intel Capital. Qualcomm is interesting specifically in the drone space because much like they did in mobile with their Snapdragon processors, Qualcomm has really made a statement saying they want to power a lot of the technology and really the processing power in drones. And so you see they have a robotics accelerator now. They've made 2 acquisitions, and they've made multiple investments in drone companies like 3D Robotics and Skycatch, just to name a few. In addition to that, there's Airware, which is actually a startup in its own right, but has recently launched the Commercial Drone Fund, which is a fund to invest in other drone startups on their platform. And there's also DJI and Excel Partners, which is not visualized, but they recently announced a similar fund to Airware's called the Sky Fund. A few other notable strategic investments. Verizon has been fairly active. Airbus, which is an investor in OneWeb, which OneWeb's plan is essentially to provide internet access to the world via over 400 satellites, I believe, put up into orbit. In addition, Legendary Entertainment, which is a very big entertainment company, invested in Magic Leap. And you can see on the right side a quote from Thomas Tull, who's the CEO. And he said, it's one of the few things I've ever experienced in my life where I came out and said, this changes everything. And Magic Leap has been a fairly stealth company in the augmented reality, virtual reality space, but the implications for entertainment are obviously very big in terms of new types of visualizations and really bridging the gap between digital digital worlds and real worlds in film and TV and things like that. So it makes sense, Legendary, to make an investment. In addition to this, also UPS just invested in a company called Sci-Fi Works, which does tethered drones and is also experimenting with consumer drones. So as we dig in more, we're going to talk about drone delivery a little later, but this is definitely an interesting investment on their end. So we're going to dig into space now. Space startups have raised over $1.9 billion since 2014, and as I said before, a lot of that really was anchored by SpaceX and OneWeb. That's $1.5 billion combined. They raised in Q1 15 and Q2 15 respectively. Q3 15 we saw a bit of a drop off at 42 million of funding across 8 deals, but there still were 8 deals. The third highest quarterly tally that we've seen besides Q2 15, Q4 14, and Q4 13, which each had 9. And the $42 million is the third highest total we've seen in the past 4 quarters. So, some notable financing in the space have been Planet Labs, which had a $70 million Series C, and that valued the company at $500 million, Mapbox and Spire, and both Planet Labs and Spire are operating in that nanosatellite space, which we're going to talk about shortly. In terms of most active investors in the space, it's a trio of investors have been most active since 2012, and this is on a unique company basis. So you have Lux Capital, RRE Ventures, and Bessemer Venture Partners. Each have done the same number of deals into unique companies in this time period. And so Lux Capital is invested in satellite imagery and satellite deployment companies in Orbital Insight and Planet Labs, which again we'll talk about shortly. And then Bessemer and RE both invest in Spire, which is another nanosatellite company. One of Bessemer's other investments in the space was Skybox Imaging, who we had mentioned was acquired for $500 million in 2014. We're looking at the most well-funded space startups. Just a brief overview. I mean, the descriptions and the funding are here, so I'm not going to harp too much on this, but SpaceX and OneWeb have been by far the most two well-funded, with Planet Labs coming in third. And SpaceX really is kind of one of the first companies that started really thinking about commercialized space travel and the idea of serving NASA and the space station and other space agencies on the commercial side. So they've built a big business that way, and everyone obviously watches that company just because of Elon Musk and all the hype around it. But yeah, there's other companies like Kymeta and Spire and Mapbox, which are each doing their own things respectively that are very impressive. So this is kind of an interesting quote that we found from Steve Jurvetson, who's a partner at Draper Fisher Jurvetson. And basically what he talks about is the level of improvement that the new space technology that he's seeing today. And so what he says, and I'm not going to read the whole quote, but basically at the end he says, you rarely see an entrepreneur pitch 100x improvement, but in space we've seen 1,000x, and really we've seen 10,000x. And so when you talk about things like falling launch costs and really commercialization of an entire industry that was previously pretty heavily regulated by the government, we're starting to see a lot of pricing fall down and almost like a Moore's law in some of the other areas, whether that's satellite imagery or launch costs or just building a satellite in general. I think that speaks to a little bit what he's talking about. When we're looking at the types of companies that have been funded in the space, this is as a percentage of all funded companies since 2012. Space services and rocket tech leads with 46%, so that can include companies like SpaceX, which develops reusable rocket technology and does commercialized space travel, all the way to space debris cleanup startups like Astroscale. This is something that people have worried about that we're going to talk about as a concern around the space, the rise of nanosatellites and overall the rise of space startups. Next, on 35% is satellite operation and tech companies. So this includes companies like Planet Labs and Spire, which are using nanosatellite constellations to try and image Earth daily or even sometimes more so. And we're going to dig into nanosatellites a bit later. And then the 19% is imagery, so Orbital Insight and Windward, companies that are acquiring satellite and a little bit of drone imagery as well, but mostly satellite imagery to try and derive unique assets about Earth. So I think that's just one of the trends we're starting to see more of as satellite imagery costs come down. Just giving a brief market map. This isn't totally inclusive of every type of company in each of these spaces, but a few examples. On the satellite side, we've talked about the Planet Labs and Spires, but also companies like Firefly Space Systems, which is just won a $5.5 million contract from NASA to work on nanosatellite and small satellite launch services. As launch costs have fallen overall, there still remains to be one of the bigger barriers because you essentially have to hitch a ride on someone else's rocket. So SpaceX has made money doing that, and I think there are companies that are even aggregating that supply to try and offer it better. And spaceflight technologies you also see on the satellite side is one of them. On the space services and rocket tech side, you have SpaceX, which everyone knows, Planetary Resources, which is working on asteroid mining and something that seems a little out there, and then companies like Action Systems, which are working on nanosatellite propulsion, and something that currently the problem with nanosatellites is once they go up, they don't have much control over pushing them back into orbit and things like that, and I think Action Systems is working on that. And then on the imagery side, we've talked about Orbital Insight and Windward. So just a few use cases. I think with some of these emerging technologies, it's interesting to see, what are the broader trends people are talking about. On the satellite imagery side, there's been a lot of different things that companies like Orbital Insight have done, and Spire and all these other companies. One of them that I think is very interesting is mining data of parking lots to understand traffic of a store. So Orbital Insight has talked a lot about looking at the number of cars and overall traffic in, say, every Walmart parking lot in the United States to understand how that compares versus a year prior, 2 years prior, and really getting an understanding of traffic. In addition, they've also done studies on things like Chinese construction growth. So obviously some of the issues people have talked about is how good the data is coming out of China on the economic side. And so if they can look at basic satellite imagery to see shadows of buildings and how they change over time, they can really get a good feel of if the construction numbers being reported are correct. In addition, there's some more humanitarian-esque things like focusing on deforestation, where some of these satellite imagery companies can see if there's infrastructure being built around a forest first, and typically with deforestation you have to build out roads and things like that, and almost prevent and hopefully prevent that. On the concern side, there's two main things that we're going to talk about, I guess. The first being SpaceX's launch failure, which they have talked about, and SpaceX, and Orbital ATK, which is another public company that does similar things. Both have had failed launches, and I think that's raised a lot of questions about how ready this technology is, and if that's going to have a real negative, ripple effect on the private space industry. So that's something people are watching, especially as a SpaceX rocket is carrying, say, 3 different private space companies' satellites up to launch, and then they all get destroyed. It's an interesting problem people are thinking about. And then on the other side, there's a headline here that says Earth's orbit is a junkyard, but there's a cleanup plan, and that kind of speaks to that company Astroscale, as well as a few others, that as these nanosatellites rise, there's going to be a lot of space debris, and people are going to have to understand how they can, hopefully prevent that from being a real problem. And kind of bridging into that, we dug into 1 or 2 key industries in each of these sectors, and the first one that we really looked at on space was the nanosatellite and microsatellite imagery enablement. And so basically cube satellites, which have really led this nanosatellite movement, are these small, very small satellites which are much lower costs, and they were born in 1999 out of Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, and Stanford, basically to get aerospace companies to launch low-cost satellites for research. And a lot of different startups have sprung up and utilize this technology and almost this like agile development around satellites to have larger constellations and have a higher revisit rate than was previously possible. The main startups in the space really are Planet Labs and Spire. And some of the use cases we've talked about, the addressable markets really span both public and private sectors. So everywhere from financial institutions for analyzing construction and parking lot traffic, and out to agriculture, like crop health for commodity trading, to National Weather Services, which maybe you're less focused on satellite imagery, but you're focused on utilizing sensors to gather better data to understand weather patterns in low Earth orbit and things like that. And then, of course, the deforestation, which we also talked about. And if you look at the general market sizing, this is a trend that, while it was started in 1999, is really starting to accelerate now. And I think part of that has been basically the falling cost of the various sensors that are in cell phones and things like that. And even on the image processing side of GPUs. And we interviewed Jimmy Crawford of Orbital Insight for our podcast, and he talked about how GPUs have been really innovated on because of gaming, but they've helped out a lot of these deep learning companies with image processing. So overall, I mean, there's going to be over 2,000 nanos and microsatellites launched through 2020, and people project the global commercial satellite imagery market to be $5 billion in 2019, and through 2016, only 50% of the nanosatellites are for commercial use. So I think we're going to start seeing more of these, and as you can see, a number that large, that's when you start thinking about space debris. Not going to go too in depth on this, but some of the satellite imagery related corporates are Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Airbus, Orbital ATK, which I mentioned is somewhat of a comp to SPACEX, but in the private markets. Digital Globe, which has been providing high-resolution satellite imagery to power Google Maps for years now, and then of course Google with their Skybox imaging acquisition. Moving to drones. So drones is definitely a little earlier or a little less funded, but just because it hasn't had those mega financings that space has. But they've still raised $426 million in equity financing since 2014. And if you look at overall drone investment activity, deals continue to tick up, and over the past 3 quarters, dollars continue to tick up, reaching an all-time high this past quarter at $139 million on 20 deals. And people have a few different reasons for this, but really the main reason is that consumer drones and quadcopters and the widespread adoption of and manufacturing of drones that aren't what people think of when they think of military drones has really come down in cost and allowed a much lower barrier to entry in the market for both developers and for manufacturers. And so we've seen over the past 2 or 3 quarters, a few major manufacturing related financings, including unique $60 million financing this past quarter. We look at the most active VC. There's been a ton with multiple drone bets, but there have been 12 VCs that have made multiple unique company investments in the overall drone ecosystem. And so, 5 of the 10 VCs have invested in Airware, but some of these names include Intel Capital and Qualcomm and Felicis Ventures and Andreessen Horowitz and Lux Capital. And these are all companies that have made multiple investments in the space. Looking at the most well-funded VC-backed drone startups, you can kind of see that the drone manufacturing side is where a lot of funding is going. So 3D Robotics, which is one of the largest or the largest North American drone manufacturer, DJI, which is the largest drone manufacturer in the world, and their market share is over 50% in the drone space. Some are projecting even higher. Unique, which they develop autopilots and operating systems, but they also develop drones overall, and then eHang, which makes the Ghost consumer drone. We look at some of the sentiment around this industry. So John Frankel, who's a partner at FF Venture Capital, said, "It's blindingly obvious to us that this is going to be a big space. It's tough to know how big it will be, but where I stand here on the foothills, I can see the mountains in the distance, and they're pretty high." And I think that speaks a lot to the overall bullishness. And I've talked about this before. I don't think that there are many industries that have had this level of almost clear-cut bullishness, and now even people are talking about how it's a bit of a overhyped space. Since really almost maybe even like the mobile platform. Doing a similar analysis as we did with space, we're going to do the same with AR/VR, looking at the percentage of funded companies in drones. Both hardware and some of the software and services side have been funded, in the number of companies at least, been funded in an equal way. So 42% are on the software and services side, and this includes companies like DroneBase, which kind of pitch themselves as Uber for drones, as well as Skycatch, which is more industrial-focused services with drones. On the hardware side, we've talked about that, 3D Robotics, Unique, DJI. What's really been underinvested, in my opinion, is the infrastructure side. So that includes companies like Dedrone and Drone Shield, which are focusing on drone defense startups, as well as companies like Airware and AirMap. AirMap is a company that just raised financing this past quarter, and they do essentially understanding the no-fly zones and mapping out where you can and cannot fly drones. And I think that the infrastructure really needs to catch up to the hardware, services, and software in order to drive the type of adoption we want. And it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem because you don't want to develop for infrastructure only to have the government build out its own plan and the FAA build out its own plan, which we're going to talk about. But I think a lot of people's concerns really rely around fleet management of drones and infrastructure of how we're going to manage a bunch of different users with on one common airspace. And moving towards some of those concerns that we talk about and use cases. So I guess starting with concerns, next step for drones, defending against them, understanding privacy. I kind of liken this to when mobile phones first came out, and everybody had a mobile phone, and then the camera phone came out, and everybody's really worried about their privacy being invaded and people taking them all over the place in public and getting their pictures put up on the internet. In addition to that, drones have also had some air traffic control issues or general no-fly zones. So you see two airliners have a 100-foot near miss with a drone above New York. And I think companies like AirMap are trying to solve that, and on the privacy side, companies like Drone Shield and Dedrone and many others are also trying to solve that. But a lot of people just worry about basically being able to fly something with a high-definition camera in these open skies. It's a real issue, but I think there just needs to be more thought around how we defend against that. On the use cases side, they're really wide-ranging, and we're going to get into a few of them more in depth, but Sci-Fi Works is one that has landed a military deal for a pocket drone. And so Sci-Fi Works is founded by Helen Grainer, who previously founded iRobot. And iRobot's general approach was build for consumers and then also build for enterprise. So iRobot built the Roomba, which vacuumed autonomously, and then they also built bomb diffusing robots. And Sci-Fi Works is doing a similar thing with building these military-style drones that are tethered, that are persistent, can stay up for 100 hours, and that because of the tether are less susceptible to being hacked and much easier to deploy in emerging situations or fast situations where you need to drone up quickly. And then on the consumer side, they launched a Kickstarter that was wildly successful for a consumer drone. Also, there's been some humanitarian efforts. Matternet is a company that's working on autonomous drone delivery, and there have been other companies doing similar things. But basically, the idea of delivering, medicine or other things to people in need during disasters. So that's something that drones have been used for overall. The FAA is really a big thought process around. It's really a big, issue and talking point around drones. And so what they've done in between trying to figure out how to really regulate these drones but still allow commercial use cases, they've issued Section 333 exemptions. And basically what that does is it allows you to apply for an exemption to operate a drone commercially. And when we look at the breakdown, which was done by Drone Analyst, who's a great research person on the drone space, the bulk of or 44% of the exemptions have come in film, photo, and video, and that ranges from everything from drones, utilizing drones in movies. I'm sure if you've seen a movie in the past 2 years, you've seen a shot where there's been a drone used to film it, as well as applications like real estate agents and artists to want to survey a home and things like that. On the inspection and monitoring side, mapping and surveying, and you see like industrial monitoring, so monitoring an oil pipeline, a solar farm, a wind farm. Typically for, say, a wind turbine, you have to have someone that climbs up to the top of this turbine to survey it to make sure everything's working well. With a drone, you can fly it up and get HD video feed to understand what's wrong, what isn't wrong, or if anything's broken. One of the industries that we're going to dive into a little bit that people have talked about a lot for drones is precision agriculture. So basically there's been a rise in precision agriculture, and some people who are longtime farmers will say that they've been doing this for a long time. But with the rise of industrial IoT products, there's kind of a new wave that's really targeting to increase efficiency of crop yields, mitigate crop risks, and just overall lower the cost of key agriculture inputs like water and fertilizer. And so typically before, drones can get closer than what people would use like planes, or can cover more land in a much more efficient way than a human being going through and marking in a book and on a piece of paper. And so the two areas where drones focus on are analysis and deployment and operations. And so the analysis side is pretty straightforward: farm surveying and monitoring, terrain feature detection, and the estimation of yields for an entire farm. The deployment and operation side, because of that the ability to fly low, they can deploy fertilizers in a much more efficient way, and they can route agriculture machinery better, and also monitor some of the irrigation equipment. Just a brief overview of market sizing. There's over 2 million farms in the U.S. U.S. crops annual cash receipts are almost $200 billion, and people right now say the agriculture monitoring market is only $2 billion. So I think in addition to monitoring and precision agriculture, just the savings on deployment and other use cases that we'll see emerge over as more drones get utilized for precision agriculture should open that market up even more. And a few corporates, again, not going to dive too deep into it, but Monsanto, John Deere, AGCO, DuPont, Trimble, and Raven Industries all have expressed either interest in drones on the precision agriculture side or have already used them. Second one that everyone talks about that isn't really as widespread in the US is drone delivery, and I think that initial kind of click came almost 2 years ago on the 60-minute special with Amazon and Jeff Bezos, and basically them showing off what they call Prime Air, which was an Amazon drone delivering packages. And so basically, as the way people are thinking about this is, as consumer behavior shifts towards this kind of on-demand trend, people are looking at how to accelerate fulfillment, how to accelerate shipping times to the same day or sooner. And so if we look at the general payload capabilities of the drones, up to 5 pounds today, and Amazon claims that covers around 86% of all of the packages over distances of 5 to 10 miles. And so if you can autonomously do this, you can do a very big service to the last mile logistics people. And it's something that the FAA has been very strict on thus far, to the point where some of the larger entities are working on this technology outside of the US. But overseas, it's definitely been talked about more, specifically in China, where SF Express currently delivers between 500 and 1,000 packages per day via drone, and they've talked about wanting to double that number or more over the next year. As I said, there have been 0 FAA approvals for commercial drone delivery, despite it being a $97 billion market for courier and local delivery. And someone named John Swope did a really great analysis on understanding the drone delivery cost as a percentage of traditional ground transportation delivery. So it's 7.5% of the overall cost. And so obviously costs fall, efficiency goes up, and it'll be a better consumer experience. It's just something that there needs to be models for. So people worry about the black drone-infested skies and just looking up and not being able to see the sky. But other countries have started working on different things. Specifically this past week, Starbucks announced that they're going to start serving the Empire State Building to deliver coffees and things like that. And in Dubai, with drones, people have talked about delivering groceries and other consumer goods to entire luxury buildings. So, as this becomes more commonplace, probably overseas first, and then maybe in the U.S., that might be like a perk that people talk about, as you have a doorman and a drone delivery, plan for your building. Related corporates are all pretty obvious. UPS, who just invested in Sci-Fi Works, FedEx, DHL, Google, Amazon, and Alibaba with its heavy interest in Chinese e-commerce. Moving to the last part of frontier tech, AR, VR, so augmented reality and virtual reality. Since 2014, these companies have raised $1.2 billion in equity financing. And so you can see that really a lot of the funding hasn't been as big as space again, but looking at Q4 14, Magic Leap really spiked that number up with its $542 million financing. But deal activity has remained above 10 deals a quarter for 7 of the last 8 quarters, and funding activity has really increased for 3 straight quarters now. And if you back out the Magic Leap funding in Q4, that would make it 6 straight quarters. So we're seeing a lot of financings, and while most of it is still early stage technology and early stage companies, there are still over $10 million plus financings in just the first 3 quarters of this year. So companies are starting to develop a little more. A few of these companies, Magic Leap, still relatively stealth. We know they're working on something in the augmented reality space. Their famous videos they've shown have been, an elephant in the hand of someone, and it looks hyper realistic. And then also on the gaming side, they had a tease demo of basically zombies coming out of the office that they're in, and you having to shoot them in augmented reality. Other companies that are most well funded is Jaunt, which is working on proprietary hardware camera specifically for a more cinematic VR experience, and then some software, as well as Matterport, which develops a system for generating 3D digital models of physical spaces and then subsequently being able to allow users to interact in virtual reality with those spaces. So their thesis is kind of, why would you remodel your kitchen or take a vacation or go anywhere without understanding, at least in some real sense, what that is like. Looking at some of the most active investors, it's the same names we've talked about. Someone that I think is one of the more interesting investors, though, is Rothenberg. So they are the most active investor without, and this is not including the companies they invest out of their River Accelerator. And so Rothenberg previously they have a River Accelerator that was previously only focused on AR and VR opportunities, but they have now since expanded that to all frontier tech. And they've invested in companies like AltSpace VR and Matterport. While Google Ventures also is invested in Jaunt, and Intel Capital, who's one of the most active investors as well, is invested in Occipital and WorldViz, among others. Looking at it from a focus perspective, it's a little more difficult because it's not as clean, more so because virtual reality is kind of seen as the last medium, and that's something we're going to talk about shortly. But commercial use cases such as BlipBar, which enables augmented reality for brands and publishers, are leading the way with 40% of all funded companies since 2012 being in that area. The second being hardware. So Oculus is kind of the main hardware company, but there have been many others that have played in this space as well, and you can see on the left here with Matterport and Jaunt and Leap Motion. They're utilizing hardware to drive more innovations in VR. So I just want to go back to this quote really quickly. Chris Dixon, who's a partner in Andreessen Horowitz and was one of the early investors in Oculus, has kind of vocally been very bullish on VR for a long time. And what he said is that VR will be the ultimate input-output device. Some people call VR the last medium because any subsequent medium can be invented inside of VR using software alone. And I think that that's something that is a pretty interesting statement, and you're starting to see that a little bit now. So if you look at companies like Netflix now are even developing for VR, because why would you want a big TV screen if you live alone when you can put on a VR headset and it can make you feel like you have an 80-inch TV screen in your home? So there's definitely thought processes around that, and a lot of the VR bulls kind of talk about how widespread that could become. Some of the news headlines we've seen and use cases range really from everything from athletes who are, training and recruiting in virtual reality to astronauts who are trying to, get a feel for space on the ocean floor to entertainment. And so what we're seeing really is a bunch of different use cases, basically being somewhere that is maybe hard to be or maybe hard to simulate, and enabling that in a more, with this new technology that's come out. Other trends we've seen, people have concerns about virtual reality and kind of with it being that last medium and that last frontier overall for any type of media, people getting, changing the way we travel. So people not getting sucked into the VR world and understanding, how people will, I guess, prevent that from happening. And it's kind of an interesting point. And Tony Parisi of Weaver said it best when he talked about how if you want to prevent it, it's already too late because we're already sucked into our cell phones. We check our cell phones over 155 times a day, and I think that it'll be a similar mentality with VR. The industry we decided to dive deep in for AR and VR is gaming. A lot of corporates have made big bets on gaming, from Facebook with its acquisition of Oculus to Microsoft and Sony, each developing AR and VR headsets of their own, to Samsung and Google. Google is one of the more interesting ones where gaming is one use case, but also just general entertainment with their low-cost cardboard headsets. So basically the thought process is you put a mobile phone in, and for $5 you have a VR headset. Alternatively, software providers, including in-game studios such as Crytek and Ubisoft, have really started to think about some of the emerging use cases and how they can create a more immersive gaming experience and subsequently drive the adoption of the hardware. And why people are targeting gaming, at least initially, is mostly because gamers are typically early adopters and are typically willing to try and get the next best thing, best graphics, best system, etc., and are very willing to spend on that. So it's something that people in the VR community have talked about as hopefully driving that adoption. And the numbers back that up. 76% of VR content was related to gaming last year. Overall, the market's $74 billion market, and if you look at the VR gaming market, it's still very small compared to what the overall market is, so there's a lot of room for growth. Some of the related corporates are, game developers like EA, Activision, and Valve, and then, Tencent, and then also some of the other people who have, gaming platforms like Sony and Microsoft. With that, we're going to go to questions. Let me try and find a few. You guys have been asking a lot of questions. What is the FAA role in commercial drone regulation? Is there any sense of timing? So the FAA essentially is controlling all of the regulation in the U.S. The timing is hard to say. The FAA missed multiple deadlines, most recently a few weeks ago, but they have now said they're targeting a Q3 2016 deadline to establish better guidelines. With that said, as this has kind of drawn out more and more, they have drastically increased the number of Section 333 exemptions that they've issued. So I think more and more people are filing for those exemptions. What are other areas or use cases for AR/VR to see pushing adoption? So I guess art is one of the more interesting ones. Oculus showed an example of something called Medium for sculpture. In addition, healthcare, specifically related to mental health. So there's both like getting over fears of social rejection and being in situations, as well as some more tangible fears where we've seen like spiders and fear of heights and things like that. And then third, obviously, which we talked a little bit, is just overall entertainment, so more immersive storytelling. And I think the entertainment side is going to be tough because it can be expensive to develop for it, but we'll see. Are there any non-obvious industries drones could affect? I guess insurance is one of the more interesting ones. So drones can survey damage after disasters, lower time to claims for things like agricultural insurance. So basically the ability to assess farms faster and assess damage faster, and also get just a bigger view is pretty interesting. And we're going to be diving more into insurance tech in the near future. Let's see. What are the pros and cons for drone imagery versus satellite imagery in commercial applications? So I guess for precision agriculture, which we talked about, drones are largely better. There's an interesting tweet that the 3D Robotics founder and the Planet Labs founder kind of had made a bet on, and basically talking about how like the lower maintenance costs and lower overall costs of drones makes it much more scalable for a set area. Having said that, for larger data projects, satellite imagery is kind of unparalleled, and as that cost comes down, I think that we'll start to see that more. So basically, we can go back to the counting cars in parking lots. If you want to do that across all the Walmarts in the U.S., it's much easier to do that via satellite imagery and machine learning algorithms to understand and identify those cars versus putting a drone on top of every parking lot. And something that Jimmy Crawford of Orwell Insight brought up in our podcast was high altitude drones, and I think that that's really interesting. Basically, the idea of somewhat persistent drones hovering 40, 50,000 feet above a city that can then image them on a more consistent basis. Any industrial use cases for AR, VR? Yeah, I mean, I don't know about industrial as much. Some have talked about like auto development, automakers, and things like that in general, modeling of more high cost intensive things. But we've also seen it in other things like surgery and doing overlays of AR on top of a surgical table so you can understand like all the vitals at all times. So that's something that people are talking about more of. That's all the time we have for today. But anyways, if you have any further questions and you want to access the underlying data, you can talk to, if you're an existing customer, you can talk to our customer support team, Jonathan McKenna at cbinsights.com and anand.sanwal at cbinsights.com. If you're not a customer, reach out to Anand or set up a free trial. That's all for today. Thank you very much for tuning in, and hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.